Layoffs are back in 2025, but this time they're a lot different.
The bloodbath in tech continues with Facebook, or Meta as it's now called, firing more than 11,000 employees.
Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, they all announced that they would be doing performance-based layoffs this year. But when I dug into it, it seems like that couldn't be further from the truth. And the employees that are left behind after the layoffs are burnt out and unable to deal with the new workload. They're being forced to compete with their peers and survive in a ruthless corporate environment. So I went through a rabbit hole of investigating why this is happening and why this ruthless corporate culture has now entered the chat. And it's not just disgruntled ex-employees that are making their voices heard, but the entire internet is chiming in.
My view is I don't even like the phrase work-life balance. I think it's misleading.
So let's get into it. Okay, so let's first talk about the mass layoffs that are happening.
Tech's supercharged trajectory of growth, record stock highs, and aggressive hiring during the pandemic, now in a downturn.
Microsoft recently announced that they'd be laying off underperforming workers, as they've always done. But when I started searching for people's personal stories on this, I found a goldmine of information. One person commented in this Reddit post, "I know people personally who were affected. None of them had any indication of low performance. They actually received annual bonuses and positive reviews. One even asked for specific performance metrics for promotions and was given vague responses, stating they were on a promotion track and to keep doing what they were doing. In the end, this is a callous layoff under the guise of low performance, so they can justify culling thousands of people with no severance and leaving them without insurance or a high amount of earned stock set to divest again in 2 weeks." And you can see that there are so many stories. I'm actually going to link this thread in the description below, but there's so many stories of these layoffs happening recently, since January of this year. When I looked further, I found an article about how this time layoffs were different. The old way at Microsoft, for example, included compassionate cuts. They had generous severance packages scaled to the years of service, extended health coverage for 6 months post-separation, vesting of upcoming quarterly stock grants, and a substantial $1.2 billion set aside for layoff-related payments. Now, however, we're seeing a complete and dramatic shift. Veteran employees with decades-plus tenures, including some who had received 200-plus rewards, were terminated without severance based on a single year of low ratings. Workers who received low ratings in 2023 but improved in 2024 were still targeted. Managers were not informed that their performance ratings would be used to determine layoffs. Now, a similar situation started happening with Meta as well. They announced performance-based cuts earlier in the year, but employees are voicing their frustration over how they're using the label performance-based to get out of paying severance and health insurance benefits. On Blind, several Meta workers accused the company of misusing performance evaluations to justify the layoffs. Some alleged that they were let go while on approved parental or medical leave. Someone stated that they consistently exceeded expectations multiple years, and then they had a baby in 2024 and got laid off. Another individual who was on maternity leave for 6 months stated that they had no history of below average performance, and now they're seeking legal advice. And there's even more with Amazon and other big tech companies as well. But the problem is these stories aren't unique. It's a new shift into the ruthless corporate culture and the adoption of AI that's causing software engineers to lose their job. And now they're entering an even more unforgiving job market.
Developers.
But why is all of this happening? Why aren't mass layoffs just labeled as mass layoffs? Well, is it the money? If you're removed from the company for performance issues, you're no longer entitled to any sort of severance, health insurance benefits, and employees have no right to demand compensation or time. But here's the thing. When it comes to money, these big tech companies are not having a problem with their profits. So here's an example of Microsoft's annual revenue history and growth rate from 2010 to 2024. So Microsoft revenue for the quarter ending December 31st, 2024 was $69 billion, which was a 12.27% increase year over year. Microsoft's revenue for the 12 months ending December 31st, 2024, so that means all of 2024, was $261 billion, which was 15% increase year over year. So these companies are not having problems with their profit. Now, if we look at Meta, their revenue and net income has drastically increased from 2007 to 2024, also not having a problem with net profit here. What I've noticed in my research is that it's more about fear and control. Companies are using this to take control back from employees, especially because it was the employees that were in the driver's seat for many years. And the fear comes from not being able to keep up with AI innovations. New startups are popping up almost every single day, each with a new breaking discovery in the LLM world. The big tech companies are no longer competing with each other, but they're competing with everyone. So what's left behind at these companies after all of these layoffs? Well, most likely a toxic work environment.
We're asked about work-life balance all the time, and my view is that's a debilitating phrase because it implies there's a strict trade-off. And the reality is, if I'm happy at home, I come into the office with tremendous energy. And if I'm happy at work, I come home with tremendous energy. And so it actually is a circle. It's not a balance.
Amazon essentially invented stack ranking, or at least they made it their own. They basically pit employees against each other to compete for limited resources, such as rewards, promotions, or the fear of getting pipped. How it would work is your performance would be evaluated every 6 months. Even if you're doing really well, if it wasn't as good as your coworkers, you'd be ranked last. And that means you'd be at risk of being pushed out of the company. This created a culture of distrust and intercompetitiveness. People started to not help their coworkers and actively sabotage them so that they could beat them at the game. And as you can imagine, this didn't foster a collaborative environment or a growth mindset for most people. Recently, this has been happening at other tech companies as well, mostly because they have the upper hand now. Originally, with Microsoft's new leadership, they had decided to take an empathetic approach.
Let's not think of empathy as something that, is just a soft skill that you reserve for your friends and family. I think it's at the root of all innovation. It's about being able to meet the unmet, unarticulated needs that comes from your innate ability to have curiosity, to learn about others, walk in their shoes, innovate on their behalf. And so I think of empathy as a necessary condition to create great solutions that are profitable and that are competitive solutions that are winning in the marketplace, as opposed to somehow this being a trade-off.
This was after the Steve Ballmer era of stack ranking at Microsoft. But now we're seeing a huge shift again with developers being forced to compete against each other so they're not ranked last on their team. So I actually came across this really interesting article. I'm going to read it from my laptop. So Microsoft has historically offered lower total compensation packages compared to its FAANG competitors, but the Microsoft discount was traditionally offset by its benefits, creating what many considered a fair trade-off. But this balance has now dramatically shifted. So now there's a new reality where Microsoft's traditional benefits clearly don't outweigh its below-market compensation. The company's previous value proposition rested on 3 pillars: work-life balance, job security, and stock appreciation potential. And now this is no longer the case. Another article suggests why working at Microsoft may no longer be worth it in 2025. And Meta, well, if you have feminine energy, forget about working at Meta.
The kind of masculine energy, I think, is good. And obviously, society has plenty of that, but I think corporate culture was really like trying to get away from it. And I do think that there's just something, it's like, I don't know, all these forms of energy are good. And I think having a culture that like celebrates the aggression a bit more has its own merits.
Okay, I'm joking, but all this to say, companies have every right to lay off employees and change their strategies. It's their company. But it's a very dangerous game to continuously overcorrect for your own mistakes. When you overhire, it's not that you will pay, but your employees will when you decide to overhire. So we talked about mass layoffs and a toxic work culture, but we haven't really touched on companies keeping a closer eye on their employees. And this is not just isolated to big tech, by the way. So number 1 is RTO, or return to office. This has finally started to become mandated across several companies, including Meta and Amazon. Previously, Meta and Amazon were completely remote during COVID, and they continued that way for a while, but in 2023, Zuckerberg started to mandate back to office measures. So this article was written in September 5th, 2023. Meta's return to office mandate went into effect Tuesday, requiring employees to work from the company's physical locations at least 3 days a week. The companies began notifying employees in June of the incoming change, which will not affect Meta's current roster of remote workers. Any employee assigned to an office, however, will need to comply with the rules starting this week. And then Amazon followed suit in 2024. Andy Jassy, the current CEO, sent out this message. I've previously explained the benefits of He's talking about working remotely. But in summary, we've observed that it's easier for our teammates to learn, model, practice, and strengthen our culture. Collaborating, brainstorming, and inventing are simpler and more effective. Teaching and learning from one another are more seamless, and teams tend to be better connected to one another. Now, he's talking about the return to office in this case. So you can actually read through this whole article. I'm going to link all of these articles in the description because I think it gives a good picture of the timeline of what's going on. So thankfully, Google and Microsoft stayed true to their word of keeping people remote, but only if productivity stayed high, which, to be fair, it is a company at the end of the day and employees are getting paid. So this is only fair. So this means that a lot of software engineers no longer have the flexibility to work from home, which is kind of a big deal for developers, especially ones like me, the antisocial ones. But companies aren't necessarily doing this for more productivity. I mean, productivity has skyrocketed since people have had flexibility to work from home. Even Amazon started to mandate badge check-ins for employees going to their local offices, even if that was in Idaho, for example, and their own team wasn't there. At that point, it's just a power move to prove that they still have control over you. And now they've increased RTO to full time, and most employees have to return to one of the many main HQs that they have, meaning wherever you live now, either uproot your life or quit. And don't even get me started on the mouse tracking movements or the monitoring of your messages on platforms like Teams or Slack. That's just a blatant misuse of the company's resources. But all of these things are indicating that the tech industry is breaking down. This is no longer the amazing, flexible, high six-figure job that everyone wants to work at. So we can't deny that there's been a lot of excitement and uncertainty when it comes to AI. On the one hand, it's a pretty amazing tool to use. I use it all the time on the job, like I'm constantly glued to my screen using Copilot or Ogloop or ChatGPT. But it does have its caveats. Now, that being said, of course, it has dramatically shifted the tech industry. Software engineers that don't increase their productivity, that don't do things a lot more efficiently or quickly, or that flat out just don't use AI on the job are at risk for losing their jobs because they're no longer able to keep up with the workload while their coworkers are actually utilizing these tools to make themselves a lot more attractive to employers.
You're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to somebody who uses AI.
If you haven't already started using AI, you definitely want to start now. Yesterday was the best time to get started with learning to code using AI. And this isn't really like the technological changes that we've seen in the past. It's more like the internet explosion of the 1990s and the 2000s. It's something that most people couldn't even begin to fathom how drastically their lives would change. But instead of attracting new developers into the industry like it did in the 1990s and 2000s, this new weird AI mantra is repelling developers from joining the industry, which shouldn't be the case. We do need developers more than ever, but again, it's a different type of developer, and companies are taking advantage of this sentiment and treating people badly because of it. Okay, so I know this video is a little more doom and gloom. I want to make a disclaimer about the companies that I've mentioned. They've also done a lot of good for the world, but right now we're seeing the market drop and people are struggling to find a job. I do believe at the end of the day, it's their responsibility to take care of their employees, as their employees are working hard to help them make a profit. Despite many people thinking that this is just a transactional thing between employee and employer, I do think it's so much more. If Jeff Bezos really wants to tout work-life harmony, then he needs to be there for employees, especially if those employees have given 16+ hour days to the job. Because let's be real, no one wants to have to relocate to go to an office, spend hours in traffic, then spend hours sitting at a desk and then coming home with your laptop only to work even more. It's just not sustainable. But that's what's happening right now. Everyone needs that opportunity to unplug for their own mental health, and companies should be held accountable for their actions, especially when they overhire in a really saturated market. Anyways, I digress. I'm going on a tangent, but where does that leave developers now? Are there any words of hope, or are we all just screwed? No, there is hope. There are ways to position yourself to become a newly evolved developer while still holding companies accountable for their actions. I've actually made a video about the harsh truth of coding. If you want to check it out, it's right there. And I think it'll help give you a better understanding of what the future is going to look like. So keep coding, learning AI, and don't let the headlines bring you down. There's a lot of crap going on right now in the industry, and if you kind of trudge through the crap and keep going, I know you can make something really, really great out of it. So good luck.